Secret of Mana holds a special place in the hearts of those that played it back in the day. Its blend of role-playing action, gorgeous visual design, and evocative music remains a real treat even today. But while the series has persisted across multiple generations since, nothing has quite managed to capture the feeling of playing the first Super NES game. So it came as quite a surprise when Square Enix announced that this classic game would receive a full-on remake for modern platforms. It's not the first time Secret of Mana has been re-released, but this is the first time that the publisher has seen fit to rebuild it from scratch. On this cross between DF Retro and modern gaming then, we're taking a closer look at the Secret of Mana remake, while stacking it up against the original Super NES version, recounting the origins of the series, and even including a full PS Vita comparison, something you wouldn't expect in 2018. You ready? Let's jump in. Since its release in 1993, Secret of Mana gained tremendous popularity on Nintendo's 16-bit system, but the series originally started life on the Game Boy as Seiken Densetsu. Christened Final Fantasy Adventure in the West, this humble Game Boy installment introduces players to a style of play quite unlike its still burgeoning Final Fantasy series. Adopting the overhead, action-driven combat of Nintendo's popular Zelda franchise, Seiken Densetsu was a hit, especially in Japan, but it was also apparent that the limitations of the Game Boy hardware limited its size and scope. Enter the Super Disc. In the early 90s, CD-ROM technology was taking the industry by storm and everyone wanted a piece, including Nintendo, but we all know how that story played out. The Sony-Nintendo alliance crumbled after Nintendo publicly abandoned the partnership to join Philips instead. Seiken Densetsu 2, which would become known as Secret of Mana in the West, started life on that format. As a supposed launch title for the Super Disc format, the sequel was shaping up to become a huge game that would take full advantage of the extra disc space rather than simply slapping a few Red Book audio tracks on the disc and calling it a day. When the CD project was killed off then, Square management pushed the team to complete the project on cartridge instead. The team was forced to cut content and dialogue, reducing the game to the form we know today, but despite the obvious shortcomings resulting from this process, Secret of Mana was considered a success. The action-driven combat stands out as its most unique feature. Up to 3 players can join in for cooperative action, quite unlike anything else on the system at this time. While exploring the world in search of the 8 Mana temples, players are treated to beautiful 16-bit pixel art imbued with personality. Beautiful rivers ripple through the numerous valleys, animated grass tiles blow gently in the wind, and color math is used to create some great effects such as this lovely fog layer. The music, composed by Hiroki Kikuta, is perhaps one of the most impressive aspects of the game. In crafting the musical score, he created his own bank of samples, lending the game a unique sound signature quite unlike any other. In the end, Secret of Mana was a great game, but it's clear that its difficult development cycle resulted in some rough edges. Besides the missing content, it often felt a little buggy. AI characters could easily become stuck on scenery, for instance. The sprite work when climbing stairs feels rather choppy, and there's a ton of slowdown in this game. Which is why a full-on remake of the game has always held some appeal. Thus we arrive at the 2018 3D recreation of Secret of Mana on PS4, PS Vita, and the PC. This new iteration of the game attempts to recreate the original experience using relatively simplistic 3D graphics, something which has caused quite some commotion amongst fans. It's true that the new 3D graphics lack the personality of the original pixel art, but I don't entirely feel it's bad either. In many ways, it resembles a mid-generation PlayStation 2 title or perhaps one of the Mega Man remakes on PSP. It is a step down stylistically, but it looks reasonably nice in motion, even if it's not pushing any technical boundaries. It is certainly evident early on, though, that this project was likely produced on a relatively low budget. Textures are used in many scenes to give the illusion of depth. Walls which should exhibit tons of detail rely almost exclusively on these flat textures, while the textures themselves are very often rather low resolution, and the overall level of detail feels rather ancient by today's standards. The color choices also leave a lot to be desired, with garish hues that fail to capture the original aesthetic of the 16-bit version. Another change made to this remake are the dialogue sequences. On Super NES, dialogue is handled like any RPG of its day with text boxes. It's a mystery how this might have played out on the Super Disc, of course, but in the final game, it's just text. The remake, however, introduces simplistic cutscenes complete with voice acting in either Japanese or English. The character models themselves aren't bad, but the animation is displayed at just 30 frames per second, while the backgrounds continue to update at 60, leading to a strange mismatch. There's also a lot of extra loading screens in the remake, complete with a rather boring font choice. On Super NES, this early cave dungeon, for instance, scrolls by smoothly from room to room, but in the remake, most of the doors and tunnels are replaced with loading screens instead. The animation work also leaves a lot to be desired. Attack animations feel stiff compared to the rather unique stylings of the original game, and the overall experience just feels a little jerky as a result. At least climbing the stairs in the remake no longer looks messy. I've always hated the way this works on Super NES. This new version also includes nice smooth character rotation when moving the character with the analog stick. It's also worth noting that while the game does include remixed music, it is possible to go into the options and select the original Super NES soundtrack if you desire. One other change that can't be restored though is this. On Super NES, when you use the Canon Transit system, you get this nice Mode 7 zoom out effect that gives you an idea of the scale of the world. I always loved this sequence, and in the remake it's been replaced entirely with the load screen. Ah well. Overall then, despite some missteps, I do feel that this remake has a mildly appealing aesthetic in a lo-fi 3D sort of way. I do prefer the original, but this isn't really that bad. Of course, thus far we've been looking at the game running on the PS4 Pro, but before we move to the other versions, it is worth noting that Secret of Mana actually runs at a native 4K on the Pro with excellent anti-aliasing. It is a very simplistic game, no doubt, but it's at least extremely clean and crisp. Over on the PS Vita, however, things aren't quite as rosy. Let's start with the good. Visually, the Vita version is surprisingly comparable to PlayStation 4. It runs at the Vita's native resolution and features detail on par with its bigger brother. Now, texture quality is pared back a touch and the water surface has been modified, but overall, it's nearly a match. It's so close, in fact, that it kind of feels as if the game itself was limited in terms of visual quality to work within the confines of the Vita. It's surprising how close character models and overall scene detail are between the two different versions. Unfortunately, even if this was a game designed with the Vita in mind, there's one real problem here, and that is performance. Yep, your eyes are not deceiving you, it is that bad. This is an action RPG and demands reasonably responsive controls and smooth performance to play its best. The Vita, however, really can't deliver this. Instead, it operates with a fully unlocked frame rate that can often hang just above 30 frames per second, but equally as often drops below it. Running around the world feels remarkably choppy because of this issue, and those extended bouts in the 25 FPS range just don't feel good at all. Of course, certain smaller rooms do manage to almost hit 60 frames per second, but this is extremely uncommon. And that's really the main problem here. It looks nice enough for the Vita, but playing a 16-bit style action RPG at such an abysmal frame rate really isn't appealing at all and makes for an experience much worse than that of the PlayStation 4 version. Now, it's true that it was never completely fluid on Super NES, but the Vita experience is much worse. At least over on the PlayStation 4 Pro, the game runs as it should, which is to say, completely fluidly. It's one of those few native 4K games that happens to run at a solid 60 frames per second on the system. Now, this isn't entirely surprising considering the visuals on display here, but hey, it's one feature which does at least help the game play better and more fluidly than the original ever could. So how about the other two platforms then? Well, base PS4 is simple enough. It looks exactly like the PlayStation 4 Pro version, but maxes out at 1080p. It's just as smooth and stable as the Pro version, so base owners do receive a good experience overall. But really, there's not that much to say on this, it's a pretty cut and dried situation. But just for good measure, here's a little frame rate graph showing the game running on the base PS4. And yeah, just like the Pro, it really is just a locked, smooth 60 frames per second, which is a far cry from Vita. Good news, but not that exciting. The PC version, however, is a little more interesting. Initially I was concerned when visiting the PC options menu, however, as it consists entirely of this. Yep, these are your options. Full screen mode isn't even exclusive full screen. However, the port is a little better than you might first believe. You see, aside from having very low system requirements, it also supports both higher frame rates, enabling smooth scrolling above 60 frames per second if you have a capable display, and supports ultra-wide monitors. Yep, Secret of Mana takes full advantage of the extra screen real estate to deliver an appealingly wide view of the action. An overhead game such as this greatly benefits from ultra-wide support, and it looks great in this game. Now, in some scenes you'll catch the edge of the model terrain here with a little black edge there, but in general, it looks pretty nice. On my monitor here, Secret of Mana runs at 3840 by 1600 at 75 frames per second with ultra-low motion blur enabled. It just looks great. Of course, all the footage in this video is recorded at 60 frames per second to match up with the rest of the capture, but hey. So while the PC version is rather light on options, it does at least support these additional features, making it my preferred way to play the remake of Secret of Mana. Beyond the ultra-wide and higher frame rate support though, it looks otherwise identical to the PS4 version of the game, as you would expect considering the visuals. Overall then, this remake of Secret of Mana is an interesting product. It's true that it feels like a budget game in many ways and lacks the charm of the original 2D art, but there's still something about it that works. At its heart, it's a good game, even with the changes made, plus the more responsive performance helps make for a more playable game overall. It's a tough sell, however, as I suspect folks that have never played the original release might actually get more out of it than those that have. It's always difficult to assess a remake like this when nostalgia is so strong. I don't believe that Square Enix has been fully successful, mind you, but I'm still glad it exists. If anything, it's a chance to see the world of Mana through a new filter. The release of this remake also opened the door to revisiting the original cart. That feeling of popping a game in decades later and finding your save still tucked away in the menu cannot be understated. Of course, it also brought to light many of the game's flaws, which have always been there. In that sense, the nature of this remake is almost fitting for a project that was always fraught with developmental woes. From its full reworking after the Super NES CD was cancelled, to the modern day struggle to reproduce a classic with what was likely a very, very low budget, it seems like a difficult journey for all involved. Still, I'm glad the series exists, and perhaps someday soon Square Enix will see fit to release the Japanese-only Seiken Densetsu collection abroad, allowing a new generation of gamers to experience the first three games in their original form. For now though, we have this remake, and it's not too bad, as long as you're not playing on PS Vita. That's all for now though. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us over on Twitter, and until next time, this is John, signing off. Oh, and stay retro while you're at it as well.